Okay, so March 25th, 2021, this is NEW302, and this is sort of Giegerich part 2, if you will. So we had spoken in the last lecture about this question around sort of Giegerich as a challenger or a primary kind of strong critique of some of the orthodox Jungian positions. And we talked a bit about Hillman really moving in a certain kind of way in his archetypal psychology towards the image. And in keeping with this notion of the deconstruction of the image, we then talked about how sort of Giegerich pulls in the other direction. Now, Giegerich is, relatively speaking, prolific. I have a stack of his collected papers in book form. And, of course, he tends to be, I would say, relatively speaking, sort of outspoken. He's an active member of the community. As well, right, he has something of a following here in Canada, so his sort of primary, editor, popularizer, Greg Mogensen, is part of the sort of London, Ontario / Stratford set. And as I've mentioned previously, that whole area is actually, traditionally speaking, something of a stronghold of Jungian thinking. That's where the Woodmans ended up, and so there's quite a few Jungians in the area. I have to imagine that part of this, at any rate, is the presence of Stratford, because there's the theater town there, but who knows. Anyway, so long story short, the point is that Giegerich is a relatively active kind of critic of the Jungian position. Oh, and we talked a little bit about Catafalque by Peter... what is that guy's last name? Peter... Anyway, there aren't that many books by that title. If you were looking for it, it wouldn't be that hard to find. And if you're really interested, you can message me, and I'm happy to send you the book. He also wrote a book called Reality, and he's written a bunch of stuff. The guy who wrote Catafalque, not Giegerich. So anyway, then we were getting into Giegerich, and we were specifically talking about, the kind of social critique that Giegerich levels at some level. We were talking about this question of the mutuality aspect, right, in analysis as a replacement for this sort of more traditional asymmetry, thinking here of kind of a Freudian psychoanalytic model, right, on the couch versus sitting behind. There is a deliberate asymmetry. There's a deliberate asymmetry in the exchange of information. And Giegerich points out that Jung himself had sort of advocated for sort of mutuality that breaks that particular boundary. And we had discussed a little bit, of course, the need for boundaries. And so where does that mean? Where does that mean? That's not what I meant to say, but maybe that is what I meant to say. Anyway, okay, and we kind of left off when we were talking about this notion of the medical stance versus the gratitude stance. So the basic of this is this, that Giegerich contends, and he cites Jung pretty heavily in doing so, that although there is this constantly advanced position that the analyst is sort of in favor of the return of the repressed, right? That he's in favor of this return of the repressed. The idea, is that actually all of that is intended to serve health. And so it's a fundamentally one-sided kind of attitude, right? Yes, you want the repressed material to emerge so that it can be processed and integrated and then neatly swept offside, and the person can return to a healthy state of living. Now, on one hand, I think that's, okay, let's actually talk about this. This is something that Jung referred to as the denial of the left hand. Giegerich points out that it's a relatively deep kind of neurosis in depth psychology, right? Insofar as there are sort of contradictory attitudes being held. There's all this talk about the embrace of the shadow, but when you get right down to it, right, there is this sorting going on. Now, I think that there's a few different ways that we can think about this that are potentially useful. So, my first take on it when I consider that idea is Well, my first take, of course, is, yeah, he's right. Maybe he has a point. But then I wonder what that point looks like. And so this, to me, is akin to sort of the live cultural question that we have around the notion of neurodiversity, right? So it's the case that we have a gradually more expansive and inclusive view of, right, of sort of neurodiversity, that the idea that one has to land on neurotypicality is akin in lots of ways to the way that the culture has also set the norm, right, in lots of other ways, right? So they're, and I would argue that to a significant extent, this is not, like necessarily a particular hegemonic feature of our culture. I think that this is a generalized feature of the way that humans categorize things and the kinds of biases that we use on what constitutes sort of typical versus atypical members, right? Typicality gradients and that sort of business. Certainly this is not the only area you see it. I will go off to anybody who will listen about my immense annoyance about the idea of the scientific concepts and mathematical concept of vertebrates versus invertebrates and Euclidean versus non-Euclidean geometry, right? So, which interestingly does link into Giegerich later. So, vertebrate versus invertebrate is particularly hilarious to me because, of course, we are vertebrates, right? We have a spine, vertebrae, and everything else is, the things that also have a spine and vertebrae are vertebrates. We're the vertebrates, and everything else is a not vertebrate, right? That is how it's categorized. This is a very vertebrato-centric kind of perspective because the invertebrates outnumber the vertebrates by vast amounts. Like, it's not even close, right? Most life is invertebrate. Most life is spineless. And so, or backboneless, I suppose, not necessarily spineless, but backboneless. And yet, where do we localize the category, right? We localize the category in vertebrates and having a backbone because we have a backbone. Likewise, right, in mathematics, we have, Euclidean geometry, which is the classic sort of Greek-derived geometry that occurs in a flat plane. And then we have all of the geometries of curvature that came after that. And that we dub the latter non-Euclidean geometry is likewise this kind of like Euclideanocentric sort of perspective on this, because non-Euclidean geometry is a massively larger sort of geometric possibility space than Euclidean geometry, and yet Euclidean geometry is what we started with, and then everything else is non-Euclidean geometry. So again, you get this centralization. And there have been loads, right, of intersectional cultural critiques about the way that sort of othering occurs within our culture. But that's not primarily what I'm concerned with here. What I'm concerned with, right, is we have extended that same notion, essentially speaking, a notion of inclusion, to all kinds of other modes. And in most of those cases, I think, yes, that is clearly, right, that is clearly a welcome inclusion. We should expand our notions of sexuality. We should expand our notions of, right, what constitutes religious practice. We should expand our notions culturally of what typicality is. So I'm for all of those things. However, this does put us in this perpetual edge case problem, right? Which is like, well, where do we draw the line? Now, as you know, I'm not much, generally speaking, for sort of drawing lines, at least not in ink. I don't mind drawing them in chalk to run some arguments, but drawing them in ink seems like a very bad set of practices to me because, what's the justification, right? Very few things have a kind of Aristotelian essence. By which I mean, right, there aren't that many cases where it's easy for us to logically derive the necessary and sufficient conditions, right? Like a list of things. Everything that meets this list is X, and everything that isn't is Y. That's hard. It's hard to do, right? This is Wittgenstein, right? This is Wittgensteinian philosophy when he makes the argument about games and the problem of family resemblance and the problem of essence and category. This is a hard problem, right? And the thing is that the number of things that we can provide sort of categorical essences for tend to be like, I don't know, elementary physical particles or minor mathematical entities. Cue again Euclidean geometry. We can give everything you need, every logical feature that you need to be counted as a triangle, right? But it's a very different thing when we're trying to draw other kinds of boundaries. And the boundary that we're trying to draw here, essentially speaking, when we look at the question of, say, neurotypicality, is like, well, at what point is the sort of functional right difference like relevant and problematic? Now, you might imagine, given how much I have harped on over the course of the year about the no free lunch hypothesis, right, and the idea that there ain't no such thing as free lunch, Tanstaffel. For every condition in which something is a useful heuristic, there is an equal number of condition, right, or an equal amount of condition, equal number of conditions in which it is a detrimental bias. And I think that as a rule can be applied, of course, to a much, 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 much vaster set of phenomena than it is generally applied to. And I think, obviously, right, I use that implicitly, and in many cases explicitly, when I'm talking about things like function theory, when I'm talking about things like personality orientation, when I'm talking about things like a kind of archetypal engagement, right, or engagement, I suppose, with one's complexes in a live way. Every one of these things represents a kind of heuristic, right? I mean, they are, when we receive the advice that we need to sort of know our own myth to navigate the world, right? Well, what does that mean? Why do we need that? Well, the answer is that we need it because figuring out the myth that we're living gives us useful shorthand to navigate the problems of our life. It's a heuristic, right? I mean, that's one way to think about it. Now, also, I mean, obviously, if you happen to be sort of an orthodox Jungian or a hardcore Jungian, you may believe that the archetypes are literally orchestrating your life, right, in some important sense, right, that they are puppet mastering events at a level that maybe naturalism doesn't necessarily swallow easily. And okay, so that's a different question. But if we're just coming at this from this basic thing, it's like, why is it useful to know your myth? Well, it's useful to know your myth so that you can identify the parts of it. It's heuristic. It's a problem identification scheme, essentially speaking, right? And in general, it's like, well, why is it so important to gain some access to your various functions? Well, it's important because your various functions are not all equally useful in every situation. I mean, it's that simple, right? If you approach a thinking problem with a feeling orientation, then it's quite likely that actually this is going to impede, right? It's going to be below the line. It's going to be in the negative bias area. And, of course, if there's sort of unspoken miscommunication between people, right, where they are coming at things with two different methods and, right, or two different functions and not discussing that fact, then that is going to be compounded, right? And by frustration. So the no free lunch thing is like, okay, there's a wide variety of different approaches. You want a certain amount of diversity in those approaches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, it is also the case, right, that there are certain configurations of being that cause far more problems than they solve, right? So, let me give you an example. It's very clear, for instance, that psychopathy as a genetic tendency within the human population, or malignant narcissism, if you want to think of it in those terms. But psychopathy, right, hair checklist psychopathy within the population is a kind of, ambient background thing. Sure. And it is the case, obviously, that we have, a set of scales genetically that determine the sort of baseline amount or talent of empathy that people have. And that's trainable, but and obviously it differs, right, between sort of affective empathy and cognitive empathy, right? The ability to understand what people are thinking in a kind of theory of mind way versus the ability to have an empathic reaction where you feel feelings in response to their feelings. That's obviously highly variable through the population, much as, okay, there's an excessive, acuity that people can have, right? So it is the case, it seems to me, a lot of the time, particularly in the modern era, often it is the case that people who use the term "I am an empath" actually mean that they're suffering from an uncomfortable degree of emotional sensitivity, right? I actually think of sort of strong empathy as being a space where one can encounter the emotions of others and they don't like rattle and overload you. But interestingly, our cultural usage lately, anyway, seems to have shifted. So a lot of the time, if people use the term empath, what they actually mean is I experience emotions in an overwhelming and overpowering way. And that, to me, is actually a slightly different thing, right? I mean, experiencing emotions in an overwhelming and overpowering way, to me, often means that there is like a certain lack of facility, right? And it's not necessarily bad. I think that having a certain kind of sensitivity, like most other things, can be useful. But I think of that as being more closely akin to the kind of emotional sensitivity and confusion and distress that creates in, for instance, autism spectrum, right? And I'm not saying that those two things are identical. I'm just saying that it's an interesting shift that has occurred. Nevertheless, right, there's obviously a spectrum of empathy, right? There are people who experience an incredibly high degree of empathy, and there are people who, baseline experience considerably lower empathy. And at the very low ends of that scale, you tend to have, right, things that we would call, psychopathy, right? People who are sort of relatively manipulative. We've talked about this trait set before, and the hair checklist and all that business. Now, I'm frustrated by the release of books like Kevin Dutton's The Wisdom of Psychopaths. And I'm frustrated by it because, frankly, so often the behavior that's associated with psychopathy is so profoundly unwise. It's profoundly foolish. And, for the most part, these people have terrible lives. There's a difference, obviously, right? A certain amount of intelligence and so on and so forth can make a big difference. It's a difference between the person who ends up in jail and the person who ends up, as a CEO of a, major corporation or something. But the point is, I'm a bit frustrated by that because it holds up the wisdom of psychopaths as though that is a thing that everyone should aspire to. Now, are there cases where you want your empathy to be down? Are there cases where it's useful to be a cool customer? Yeah, of course there are. And we've talked about this too, right? I would want my surgeon, for instance. I don't want my surgeon to be squeamish. I don't want my surgeon to cut into my body. And since I was recently surgeoned upon, this is especially poignant for me, right? I don't want my surgeon to be squeamish. I want my surgeon to be approaching it in a technical way. To be perfectly honest, although I want my surgeon to care about the outcomes, the reason that they care about the outcomes is less important to me. It's not necessarily the case that I need my surgeon to care about me as a person, right? What I need, so if they're doing it for totally self-aggrandizing, ego-supporting reasons, where they're like, I'm playing God with this body, and right? And this is, statistically not, I wouldn't say it's the dominant position among surgeons, at least I don't think. But it is statistically reported, right? God complex stuff among surgeons is sort of a known factor, and the predominance of a higher rate anyway of psychopathic traits among surgeons is well known. There are some professions where you see it turn up. Now, so are there cases where you want it? Sure, there are cases where you want it, and this is the argument that I've already made, which is look, these genes keep turning up in the population, and there's a natural kind of corrective limit in both directions, right? If you get too many, if you get too few vampires, so to speak, that's a rude way to refer to it, but if you get too few psychopathic people, then the problem is that the population becomes sort of vulnerable to them. And vulnerable, right? So, let's say that there are two groups living next door and one has a psychopath and one doesn't. The psychopath is going to enact, possibly, violence against the second group, or is going to take advantage. If there are too few psychopaths in the population, their ability to take advantage becomes very high. Which, you might argue, gives them some degree of Darwinian success, and then maybe their genes, propagate more easily. I don't know. Possibly. It's a bit of an evolutionary just so story. But in any event, right? Okay, so that's one possibility. The other possibility is, of course, that psychopathy becomes extremely widespread. And what happens there, of course, is that everybody becomes wary, right? So then they're on the lookout if it's really widespread. And so there's this natural balance. You can't have too many. A society that was completely composed of people with high psychopathic indexes would, I suspect, completely implode. There would be no trust relations. It would be very hard, I think, to maintain, human social ties under those conditions. Maybe not. Maybe they would self-organize into a glorious, perfectly efficient society. Who knows? But my sense of it is that that is quite unlikely. But likewise, if you have sort of none, if we move entirely into kumbaya reality, that seems to pose its own kinds of problems. There are indeed certain things you want. And that's further evidenced, I mean, not that this is exactly a rah-rah pitch for the military, but it's further evidenced by the fact that we know that people who work in special forces and so on and so forth, who may not naturally possess these traits, are capable of training their brains into enacting those traits, right? They're capable of training them. So they can sort of turn it on, or I guess turn it off, empathy-wise. They can go cold to get the job done. So they can emulate the pattern. And of course, it's inducible, but we're not going to talk about cosmetic neuroscience today. So, okay. So, nevertheless, right, it's not that I don't think that there's some utility there, but definitely it is also the case that there are relatively extreme versions of psychopathy that are not functional, right? They have very bad lives. And we can look at that and say, well, the thing is that we haven't found a place for them, right? Like, we haven't made a social space for them to do their thing. Well, that's kind of true. This is the same sort of argument that you would use in a regular neurotypicality argument, right? So, for instance, right, there was a rash of articles maybe 10 years ago about people who were on the spectrum, and this is before they sort of revoked the term Asperger's, but people who were on the spectrum, right, taking up jobs, certain kinds of jobs in software, because there is a kind of attention to detail that one often sees, right, in that kind of cognitive set, that turns out to be really, really good for checking code, which is incredibly tedious under most conditions, right? So checking hundreds, thousands and thousands of lines of code. And it turns out that, yeah, if you happen to be really, really detail-oriented and pretty, meticulous, it's a good space for work, right? So these stories always were advanced in the same way. They were always advanced in, look, it turns out that this, right, thing that we thought of as a disease is, in fact, quite useful under the right conditions. Sure, right, of course. Likewise, there are some forms of sort of developmental delay, right, where there has been some pushback. So, things like Down syndrome are, essentially speaking, eugenically, on their way out of the population, right? People are pre-detecting the markers for Down syndrome and exiting stage left, right? They're choosing not to have those children. And for the most part, people are approaching this in a kind of it's just I don't want to sign up for the lifelong engagement in that particular way, da-da-da-da-da. But that is a judgment towards neurotypicality, essentially speaking. And there's been an interesting thread of, not pushback exactly, but sort of lament, almost, I would say, among people who are talking about certain kinds of developmental delay and how wonderfully enriching it can be. There are certain kinds of developmental delay where the people are deemed to be so happy and cheerful and guileless, and right, you'll get these kinds of accounts pretty routinely. Now, I mean, that certainly isn't universally true in every case of developmental delay, right? But there's something to be said here. Maybe this is something that is less of a bug and more of a feature. How do we know, right? How do we know? And what are we losing here? This is likewise the argument that is made, right, around the deaf community, which, likes to say, hey, we're not a disease. We're a culture. And, on one level, we look at that and we're like, okay, yeah, sure, that's fair. You have your own language and your own way of doing things. But nevertheless, we're in a very different position if we ask ourselves the question, so would I want my children to be deaf? Would it be okay for people to choose to have deaf children? Would it be okay, right? If two deaf people have a child and they choose to have a child who can hear normally, right? Is that in some way, let's say they choose to have a deaf child. Let's say they choose to have a deaf child when that is correctable or something, right? And if you extend that idea to blindness, right? If two blind people choose to have a blind child so the child can be part of blind culture, how do we feel about that? But essentially speaking, this is the same kind of question, right? So we are caught and we're caught in this thing around the boundaries of what we consider to be, right, like, sort of, I don't know, whatever, potentially included versus, at some level, pathological. Like, these are questions we ask. There's no question that there are certain kinds of conditions that it would be very hard to make this argument for. If you're born with your organs on the outside of your body or something, this is not something where you're like, oh, that's wonderful, because people with organs on the outside of their bodies are doing a valuable organs on the outside of their bodies thing in society. Maybe somebody would make that argument, but it seems like just inflicting a hellish degree of suffering on somebody. And like, what's the specific cultural, I don't know, benefit, or what do they get out of it? Like, it just, So there are these cases, and when we approach the question of neurotypicality, that starts to get kind of hairy. Now, I'm a proponent for a pretty wide degree of this sort of thing, right? I think that attention disorders need to be a bit less pathologized than they currently are. I'm not convinced. There are definitely cases where they interfere with people's lives, and under the principle of it's only a problem if it's a problem, right? Like, if it's causing problems. But how many of those problems are problems in systemic expectation, right? Like, we ask children to do something that from an evolutionary perspective and from a historical perspective is highly unnatural, right? Sit and focus their attention on small abstract symbols and the manipulation of those abstract symbols for long periods of time. This is just not, it's not reflective of what human beings evolved doing, nor what human beings, have done for most of their history. It's just not the case. And so, one wonders to what extent it's like, the great failure of an attention deficit case is that you can't conform to a dehumanizing system, right? Without then the application of stimulant medication. I also, of course, as I've said, think it's massively overdiagnosed. I think there are lots of other things that get overdiagnosed as attention, and this is a fundamental problem of we don't have a very strong understanding of what attention is. I do work in this area, incidentally, because I do work around attentional neurofeedback, and so endless amounts of writing that we've done have tried to slam up against this problem that attention is so poorly understood and so poorly defined. As in psychology, where it's endlessly frustrating when you get these homuncular arguments, right? So, like, working memory in psychology is just maddening, because it's got that central executive. That's the decider piece. Anyway, okay, so leaving that aside for a moment, there are lots of other things that are, relatively speaking, neurodiverse that I think deserve more sort of respect than they get, right? So I think spectrum cases deserve more respect than they get. I think that psychopathy, such as it is, actually has, a valuable place in society, but it needs to be, society needs to figure out what it's doing in this respect, and it really hasn't. I think that there are kind of significant degrees of schizotypal behavior that need to be depathologized, and so on and so forth. Like, there are a lot of things that need to be depathologized. That said, I'm not convinced that that means that absolutely everything de facto needs to be depathologized. Or at the very least, maybe it does need to be depathologized, but that doesn't mean that everything is necessarily equally, right? Included. But that's what I'm saying. That's a hard problem, right? It's not simple. So this is part of the thing that Giegerich is getting at. Because we say in depth psych that we want the return, right? The return of the repressed. We say in depth psych that we want to embrace the shadow. But really, in the back of our mind, it seems like we are holding this notion of health that is about integration. It's about wholeness. It's about functionality. Now, never mind, right, the basic idea that, succeeding and adapting in a sick society is no sign of health, right? I'm mangling that paraphrase. The actual expression is, what is it? No sign of sanity. No. It's not sane to conform to an insane world. Anyway, whatever, you get the idea. I can't, for some reason, it's early. I can't quite recall that phrase. Oh, that's going to drive me crazy. Oh, hey, by the way, though, BASK. Dissociation BASK. B-A-S-K. Behavioral Affective Sensation Knowledge. Sensation. You just had to let it go and it'll come to you. Okay, so you're going to put your hand out. You can't grab at the butterflies. You have to just put a finger out. Yeah, that's going to bug me. Anyway, whatever. The point is that, right, this question of embracing the shadow and this question of, embracing these parts seems to be subsumed to this kind of medicalization. So as an idea, right, when the neurosis appears, when there is this symptomatic expression that's problematic, right, Jung makes it pretty clear in a bunch of places that really, we're wrong to think of this as a problem. It's our best friend. And this is a hard line for people to hit on. I did this with a client not that long ago, where they were quite afraid about a return of a particular kind of somewhat OCD-driven anxiety. And they were like, I'm just afraid. I'm afraid that it's going to come back. And I was like, yeah, I know you're afraid. And it is going to come back. But when it does, I want you to remember this phrase. Hello, my old friend. Hello, my old friend. See, the thing is that, right, the entire notion of parts work, if we filter it through in this way, has to do with the idea that fundamentally these various pieces of us are not out to get us. They are occluded by shadow because of their exile. We dissociate them first, right? We push them away first. We just don't like what they're on about first. And we push them away. And when we push them away, they start to get desperate. They start to try to get our attention. And they start to become strange out in the dark. And the whole thing is, right, that people come in with this desire to excise components of themselves, right, to excise and exile. How do I chop this off? How do I stop this thing? The symptomatic presentation that they get secondary to that dissociation, secondary to that split, right, is in some ways doing them a favor. It's bringing this to their attention. It's trying to get their attention. And, obviously, we can play slightly fast and loose with that because it's like, well, or it's trying to do something and that causes a problem. And you have to take a somewhat high-level view. But ultimately speaking, right, it's pointing towards, a split, break, a bend, a skew. It's pointing towards the places where the psyche is fractured. I mean, that's precisely what the neurosis does. It is, in some sense, the best friend. And, it's also the path of growth. And Giegerich has some choice things to say about the fantasies of growth, but it's also the path of growth, in the same way as the inferior function is the path of growth. So, right, when I talked about this dream my client had about moving the block, right, working together with the piece of himself to move the block. And it's like, right. You descend through the inferior function. And because it is the inferior function, it's necessarily shrouded in shadow. Right? You don't want to deal with it. It's the left hand. Apologies to left-handed persons, but you know what I mean. It is clumsy. It is not entirely reliable. It is sinister. And that is what Jung means by the denial of the left hand. See, this is generally built into depth psych. But at the same time, when we actually succeed in bringing the neurosis, what's the game? Well, the game is, and now we're going to make the neurosis nice. Now we're going to get it to play along. Now we're going to get it to conform. It's just not accepted on its own terms. This is the critique that Giegerich is making, and he's making it pretty strongly based on critiques that Jung himself made, right, about this problem. Now, I think this is a really interesting question, actually. This is a really interesting question. To what extent do we actually need to conform ourselves, right, to some unitive ideal of health? And there is a leftover idea. What he's saying is when it shows up, we don't show gratitude. Instead, we medicalize it, right? Oh, these are your symptoms. We medicalize it. And then it's about this short order thing. When we see a slip back, it aggravates us. And some of that is imposed on sort of psychotherapy and analysis, obviously, by the constraints of a system that really wants things to be brief, right? Can you do it in 8 sessions? Can you do it in 6 sessions? Can you do it in 4 sessions? I was talking to somebody, they're in Barcelona, but I was talking to them. They're from Germany. And they were talking about the German system, and, I described this, and da-da-da, and they said, oh, really? That's interesting. Like 24 sessions would not be an uncommon, right? Apparently the German system is quite stringent about checking the credentials and so on and so forth of the people who are providing care, but thereafter this idea that it might unfold over time is something of a given. It's such a European idea. Anyway, but here, it's like it's the fast food drive-through model. We want to give, this kind of like minimal intervention. And never mind that, we want to also treat the thing and only the thing. Patch me up. Never mind the conditions. Never mind the whole organism. Never mind the sort of holistic overall gestalt of the life. There's a real driver, and that driver is, of course, economic, right? It's insurance company driven. So I'm really interested in this basic question. Now, you can actually see, if you consider the first lecture that we were talking about this in, you can actually see that there's a bit of convergence here, weirdly, between Giegerich and Hillman. Because where Hillman is saying, right, this unitive emphasis on the self is sort of disrespecting the polytheistic integrity of the various archetypal aspects of being, right? We should treat these things as sort of independent gods and independent domains in their own right? Let them have their own realm and let them have their own sort of authority and autonomy and respect. Treat them as a family of gods and stop trying to, mesh them into a five-headed dragon, so to speak. And in some ways, this is kind of what Giegerich is saying too. It's interesting because he does move one step past this, but I mean, if you get at the basics, he's saying like, we're not approaching these sort of splits in ourselves, these dissociations with gratitude. We're approaching them medically. This is the denial of the left hand. And the denial of the left hand is couched together with this eschatological fantasy, right? So eschatological fantasy, or eschatological fantasy, well, I guess it's not eschatological because that would be shit-based. I don't know if that's a Freudian slip. It's maybe a Jungian slip. The shit at the end of time. Anyway, whatever. These are fantasies of apocalypse, okay? That's what the term means. So it's a useful term to pick up. Eschatology, at least I believe that's the pronunciation, eschatology, is the study of apocalypses, of ends of the world, right? It's a good one to have in your back pocket along with soteriology, right, which is the study of salvation. Right, there is this eschatological fantasy that Giegerich picks up on, which is, like health, normalcy, individuation, functionality, right? And that is what's sort of we're subsumed to. Everything, the lion shall lay down with the lamb. That's basically what he's saying, to get to sort of the Bible, the Revelations, right? The lion shall lay down with the lamb. This is the basic idea, and what he's saying is, like, that's not very respectful. Like, why not just treat the neurosis on its own terms? This really puts me on a pin. I'm not totally sure how to feel about it. Like, Now, he does move one move beyond, and what he says is, aha, but here's the thing. In recognizing this neurosis within psychology, psychology should accept its own neurosis. So it should continue to operate this way, but just be aware of it. And at that point, it's like, we've inceptioned down 3 layers, and I'm having now a hard time sort of parsing the argument. But I think it's very interesting, and it's worth thinking about. It's like, oh yeah, now having identified it, okay, just accept the paradox. And I'm quite pro accept the paradox, but like, I don't know, this seems to raise a lot of live questions. The other interesting thing that he talks about in this article, of course, I mean, it's actually titled On the Neurosis of Psychology, and the third of the 2. He's talking, and this is part of this mutuality question, but he's talking in part about the idea that because there is a mutuality in analysis, that the field space produces a third, right? This is, I think, very interesting if you compare it to the notion of the third man phenomenon. I highly recommend the book by that name, I think it's just called The Third Man. It's not called The Third Man Phenomenon. Anyway, it's about historical cases. It's not therapeutic. It's about historical cases of people who, under duress, experience a phantom other who accompanies them. I think I talked about it in first semester to some extent, because it's one of the things I often talk about with respect to the basic psychodynamic hypothesis. So that idea that there is, essentially speaking, that the relationship has a personhood and a psychic reality all its own. And that's, I think, actually very important to remember. It's the case in relationships of all kinds, right? When you're dealing with conflict in romantic relationship, you need, for instance, when you're doing couples work, I think, to be sliding between, this is something I'm always saying, you need to be moving the slider back and forth between the notion of individual agency, and therefore blame, and dynamic. And this is important because people, when they're in conflict in relationship, be it romantic relationship or otherwise, right, family relationship, friendship, whatever, when they're in conflict, there is this desire to be like, right, I'm in the right and you're in the wrong, and you did a bad thing and I am the victim of that thing, and right, there's a tendency to want to try to put an asymmetry into the situation, right, to try to produce a kind of power gradient, essentially speaking, a moral power gradient. This, in my experience, is not helpful. It's important because if it's not done to some extent, you can't get things like forgiveness, right? You can't get things like being contrite. You can't get things like apology. Apology is somewhat contingent, actually, on having that gradient. But the desire to drive things into that gradient without paying attention to the dynamic causes far more problems than it solves. This is, it takes two to tango. But when people say it takes two to tango, what they usually mean is it's your fault too, right? Which is not, it's not the same thing. It takes two to tango means literally, it's like, look, we had an interlock here of factors, some of which were conscious and a lot of which were unconscious. There's something about the way that we interact that we're not picking up on that causes these problems. That, right, is the level at which you often want to look. It's like, okay, if you are reifying the relation, if you're sort of affirming it, if you're saying, you know what, this relationship matters to me, and so let's try to fix it, then at that point, it's less relevant, right? It's like, who's to blame? Figuring out who's to blame and then making them pay reparations, it just doesn't work that well. And it doesn't work that well, I mean, look at the difference with, say, World War I. In World War One, this is seeming like a jump, maybe, but in World War One, right, the great powers of Europe went to war. Germany lost the war, and they said, you're to blame, and you're going to pay everybody. And what happened? It drove them into, economic penury, and it induced a kind of massive surge of resentment that culminated in World War II. Like, it just wasn't effective. Contrast that, okay, to cases where, after the conflict is complete, what happens is that people step in and they provide aid. There's a kind of like no-fault insurance method. And notice how this no-fault method has come, right? It occurred in the Marshall Plan. It occurred in, right? The notion of no-fault insurance is likewise, like, it's a waste of time to try to figure out who's to blame a lot of the time. There are easier ways to figure out if somebody is a problematic actor. We've moved this way in terms of our notion of divorce. Right? Divorce used to be entirely based, right? The possibility of getting a divorce required somebody to be to blame. And we've moved away from that. And you might think that that is a cultural move of us trying to squirm out of responsibility. But I think actually what it largely is it's a practical response to these problems about blame assigning, that they don't allow for easy, right? We've seen the same thing in alternate justice systems. So the idea of moving various kinds of negotiation in cultural events away from a kind of punitive, legalistic model, right? But it's hard for people to do. I know people that are involved in that sort of thing where they've, tried to be in a reconciliation and restorative justice sort of framework. And everybody has talked very nice. But, of course, what's happening actually is that people are engaged in, revenge gossip behind people's backs, and, right, that people are sort of committed to it until it doesn't serve them, and then they revert to another mode. The desire to pluck eyes for eyes is a very strong one, right? This is why your, axial age religions, not that these are exclusive, but, your Christianity and your Buddhism place this kind of emphasis on resisting the earlier mode through an appropriation of very deliberate sort of practices of love and compassion, right? Into dissolving away this kind of like eye for an eye justice stuff. So we've had that kind of move, we've had that kind of shift, occurring. And when we're talking about the third, right, that's really the localized space. The third is the being that is the relationship reified. It's the child, the alchemical child of the pairing. And it can be really palpable, right? If you have had a deep relationship with somebody, or if you're in a new, very charged relationship with somebody, you begin to get that sense of the palpability of the third very soon. And the idea that this is also fundamental within the sort of analytic relationship between the analyst and the analysand, or between the psychotherapist and the client, I think is a really striking and important thing. I think it forms anyway, but if, it's formed within the spirit of mutuality, that's one thing. If it's formed within the spirit of asymmetry, I think that there is a kind of distortion that occurs. Now, obviously, right, there's an argument to be made against this, which is that, right, the very field of the projection, right, the transference, is where the work happens. So, like anything, it's the sort of thing where it's like, right, we want to be able to move the slider. There are circumstances where it's useful and circumstances where it's less useful. But it requires a certain degree of cultivation, right? It's not sort of present. Therapists, often kind of default to a removed sort of position. And some of that is about trying to toe the line around boundaries, and it's understandable, because you don't want to hurt the client. You don't want to get in trouble, right? But also there's this question, like, how are you bringing yourself in a human way, right? And how are you respecting that third in the triangle? This is just a generalized thing. A therapeutic relationship is a relationship first. It has particular rules, but it is a human relationship above all. And that's not sort of removable. There are special conditions that are placed on it, but there are special conditions placed on all kinds of relationships, right? And those conditions are for people's general protection. We try to do those things basically to keep, bad actors or people who would take advantage from causing trouble, or not even cases where people are taking advantage per se, but it's to prevent people from sliding into things against perhaps their better judgment, right? So obviously it's the case that, sexual boundary things with therapists are there to prevent an abuse of power. Of course, that's true, right? Because, one person is vulnerable at some important level, and the other person is authoritative, and, like, there could be a really gross abuse of power. And you don't have to look very far in the world to find people grossly abusing their power in the sexual domain. Like, that's, it's known, especially in the last few years. I mean, this stuff has come up, in enormous surges, right? But there is a secondary case, and the secondary case, of course, is this situation where neither party is being malevolent, exactly. Both parties are simply giving in to a desire. And the thing is that desire, it might not seem immediately problematic, and it might not seem power-driven, right? As opposed to the first case where somebody is very deliberately using their power, using their authority and whatever. It might seem totally fine, but the question is, like, what problems does that potentially cause? That's something of an open question, to be honest, right? When you look in the research, there do seem indications that it causes some pretty serious problems. You also, as you might expect, find a significant number of cases where people sort of remove themselves from the therapeutic relationship for long enough that they take up another kind of relationship. And that's, honestly, not that surprising. Like, really, is it? It's in the way that it's not that surprising in the parallel domain when students and instructors wind up romantically engaged in various ways. And this, of course, we all know that this happens, right? And there has to be some requisite degree of distancing, right? It would be an appalling abuse of power for this to occur under certain kinds of conditions, because of the power imbalance, because of the whatever, right? All those things. But at the same time, if humans meet each other, right? Of course, there are going to be cases where humans meet each other and they hit it off, right? Independent of the role. Of course, that's true. And so, this raises problems, real problems, right? It's a boundary question. On one hand, I'm inclined to err on the side of caution, right? I think it's better to just err on the side of caution and make sure that nobody ends up, hurt or damaged or abused. And that is indeed where we've kind of gone in this. But the question is whether or not erring on the side of caution right, in fact ends up having a distorting effect insofar as it produces a guarded asymmetry, when what you need is an openness and a mutuality. That's also part of Giegerich's point. So anyway, I hope that unpacks things a little bit. I know that was a little bit all over the place. Giegerich, I mean, makes some other really interesting points. As I mentioned, he mentions this kind of like the non-Euclidean geometry and Euclidean geometry. And he makes, he references a really interesting point that you can understand Euclidean geometry in terms of the wider field of non-Euclidean geometry, but not vice versa. There's no way to turn Euclidean geometry into non-Euclidean geometry, but you can turn non-Euclidean geometry into Euclidean geometry. So like the lesser case. He plays with that idea a bit, which I think is really, really interesting. And he uses this to level a criticism against the kind of reductive ideas that we often see around sort of archetypal encounter. Fascinating stuff. So, I mean, if you're interested in this sort of material on an abstract intellectual level, he's definitely worth a read. There are things where I think he's a provocateur, and I disagree sometimes with either the strength or the formulation that he uses, or I think he's just pushing a point too far. And this sort of raises the question again about a language of training versus a language of explanation. And I'm not going to resolve this, but I'm going to raise it. So, for instance, when he's talking about this question of the denial of the left, right, that we say we want to return the repressed, but then ultimately speaking, we're putting things on the surface of health, one wonders to what extent this is a question of language of training versus language of explanation. It could well be. So we say, when people are taking up meditation, that they ought to be non-judgmental, right? You ought to adopt a stance of non-judgment. Because that is a useful thing to say, to give somebody an idea of the way that they ought to be approaching the contents of their mind. But we don't mean it. We don't literally mean that. We don't mean be non-judgmental. Because there is, in fact, a correct way to meditate. If you're totally non-judgmental, you let your thoughts do whatever you want. And that's not true. That's not what we do. Right? We identify them, label them, and return to the breath. So you can see there's a split here, right? There's a split here between the language of training where it's useful because we're normally so judgmental to emphasize the non-judgmental aspect of mindfulness, right? There's a useful move there to emphasize it. But by the same token, it's not literally speaking true that it's non-judgment. There is judgment involved. There is. It's judgment of a different sort than the sort that we normally use, but it's not non-judgmental, not literally. The language of training is different than the language of explanation at the end of the day. Maybe this is a case of such a thing in Giegerich and what he's getting, right, not in Giegerich, rather in Depsych. Maybe that's the case. Maybe Giegerich is getting hung up on this distinction, that he's getting hung up on the problem that the language of training differs from the language of explanation. I don't want to resolve that. I want to leave that open, as I, in fact, want to leave most of these issues open. I think Giegerich is, like, a terrific provocateur, and he's, not just a provocateur, he's made good theoretical contributions, too. But, like, I think that Giegerich puts much-needed pressure, theoretically speaking, on the idea in a particular direction. So, if you've not read these papers, they're a little tricky. I think I've made that clear. They're a little bit tricky. But they are nevertheless totally worth the read, especially if you were interested in some of these kinds of deeper issues around this. And to be honest, I would recommend, I didn't put it on, I almost put it on, but I also recommend, he's got a whole run of papers. The book that the World Wide Web paper is collected into is called Technology and the Soul. And I think the first 4 chapters of that book are devoted to his papers about the atom bomb. And I know that the atom bomb, I mentioned this during the Watchmen week, but I know that the atom bomb is sort of less present for people in generations younger than me. It's sort of less omnipresent, although perhaps not deservedly so. But nevertheless, it's very interesting to consider the sort of symbolic and archetypal weight of the atom bomb and what it meant for the 20th century and what it meant for human consciousness. And he does just a bang-up job of exploring that stuff. It's not complete, but it's interesting. Okay, so, good. And on that, I am relatively caught up on lecture for this class. I'm still behind on lecture for other classes, and so my recording continues. But thank you again for your patience, and I hope this is interesting, and I'll see you guys, well, for office hours later today, obviously at noon, and of course for class next week, hopefully all caught up. Okay, if I don't see you for office hours, have a lovely weekend.